Chapter 6 of the Theory of Social Revolutions. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Theory of Social Revolutions by Brooks Adams. Chapter 6. Inferences. As to the universe, which at once creates and destroys life, is a complex of infinitely varying forces, history can never repeat itself. It is vain, therefore, to look in the future for some paraphrase of the past. Yet, if society be, as I assume it to be, an organism operating on mechanical principles, we may perhaps, by pondering upon history, learn enough of those principles to enable us to view, more intelligently than we otherwise should, the social phenomena about us. What we call civilization is, I suspect, only in proportion to its perfection, a more or less thorough social centralization, while centralization, very clearly, is an effect of applied science. Civilization is accordingly nearly synonymous with centralization, and is caused by mechanical discoveries, which are applications of scientific knowledge, like the discovery of how to kindle fire, how to build and sail ships, how to smelt metals, how to prepare explosives, how to make paper and print books, and the like. And we perceive on a little consideration that from the first great and fundamental discovery of how to kindle fire, every advance in applied science has accelerated social movement, until the discovery of steam and electricity in the 18th and 19th centuries quickened movement as movement had never been quickened before. And this quickening has caused the rise of those vast cities which are at once our pride and our terror. Social consolidation is, however, not a simple problem, for social consolidation implies an equivalent capacity for administration. I take it to be an axiom that perfection in administration must be commensurate to the bulk and momentum of the mass to be administered. Otherwise the centrifugal will overcome the centripetal force, and the mass will disintegrate. In other words, civilization would dissolve. It is in dealing with administration, as I apprehend, that civilizations have usually, though not always, broken down, for it has been on administrative difficulties that revolutions have for the most part supervened. Advances in administration seem to presuppose the evolution of new governing class, since apparently no established type of mind can adapt itself to changes in environment, even in slow-moving civilizations, as fast as environments change. Thus a moment arrives when the minds of any given dominant type fail to meet the demands upon them, and are superseded by a younger type, which in turn is set aside by another still younger, until the limit of the administrative genius of that particular race has been reached. Then disintegration sets in, the social momentum is gradually relaxed, and society sinks back to a level at which it can cohere. To us, however, the most distressing aspect of the situation is, that the social acceleration is progressive in proportion to the activity of the scientific mind which makes mechanical discoveries, and it is, therefore, a triumphant science which produces those ever more rapidly recurring changes in environment to which men must adapt themselves at their peril. As under the stimulant of modern science, the old types fail to sustain themselves, new types have to be equally rapidly evolved, and the rise of a new governing class is always synonymous with a social revolution and a redistribution of property. The Industrial Revolution began almost precisely a century and a half ago, since when the scientific mind has continually gained in power, and, during that period, on an average of once in 2 generations, the environment has so far shifted that a social revolution has occurred, accompanied by the advent of a new favored class and a readjustment of wealth. I think that a glance at American history will show this estimate to be within the truth. At the same time, such rapidity of intellectual mutation is without precedent, and I should suppose that the mental exhaustion incident thereto must be very considerable. In America, in 1770, A well-defined aristocracy held control. As an effect of the Industrial Revolution upon industry and commerce, the Revolutionary War occurred. The colonial aristocracy misjudged the environment, adhered to Great Britain, were exiled, lost their property, and perished. Immediately after the American Revolution, and also as a part of the Industrial Revolution, the cotton gin was invented, and the cotton gin created in the South another aristocracy, the cotton planters, who flourished until 1860. At this point the changing of the environment, caused largely by the railway, brought a pressure upon the slave owners against which they, also failing to comprehend their situation, rebelled. They were conquered, suffered confiscation of their property, and perished. Furthermore, the rebellion of the aristocracy at the South was caused, or at all events was accompanied by, the rise of a new dominant class at the North, whose powers rested upon the development of steam in transportation and industry. This is the class which has won high fortune by the acceleration of the social movement and the consequent urban growth of the 19th century, and which has now for about 2 generations dominated in the land. If this class, like its predecessors, has in its turn mistaken its environment, a redistribution of property must occur, distressing, as previous redistributions have been, in proportion to the inflexibility of the sufferers. The last 2 redistributions have been painful, and if we examine passing phenomena from this standpoint, they hardly appear to promise much that is reassuring for the future. Administration is the capacity of coordinating many, and often conflicting, social energies in a single organism, so adroitly that they shall operate as a unity. This presupposes the power of recognizing a series of relations between numerous special social interests, with all of which no single man can be intimately acquainted. Probably no very highly specialized class can be strong in this intellectual quality because of the intellectual isolation incident to specialization, and yet administration or generalization is not only the faculty upon which social stability rests, but is possibly the highest faculty of the human mind. It is precisely in this preeminent requisite for success in government that I suspect the modern capitalistic class to be weak. The scope of the human intellect is necessarily limited, and modern capitalists appear to have been evolved under the stress of an environment which demanded excessive specialization in the direction of a genius adapted to money-making under highly complex industrial conditions. To this money-making attribute all else has been sacrificed, and the modern capitalist not only thinks in terms of money, but he thinks in terms of money more exclusively than the French aristocrat or lawyer ever thought in terms of caste. The modern capitalist looks upon life as a financial combat of a very specialized kind, regulated by a code which he understands and has indeed himself concocted, but which is recognized by no one else in the world. He conceives sovereign powers to be for sale. He may, he thinks, buy them, and if he buys them, he may use them as he pleases. He believes, for instance, that it is the lawful, nay more, in America, that it is the constitutional right of the citizen to buy the national highways, and, having bought them, to use them as a common carrier might use a horse and cart upon a public road. He may sell his service to whom he pleases at what price may suit him, and if by doing so he ruins men and cities, it is nothing to him. He is not responsible, for he is not a trustee for the public. If he be restrained by legislation, that legislation is in his eyes an oppression and an outrage to be annulled or eluded by any means which will not lead to the penitentiary. He knows nothing and cares less for the relation which highways always have held, and always must hold to every civilized population, and if he be asked to inform himself on such subjects, he resents the suggestion as an insult. He is too specialized to comprehend a social relation, even a fundamental one like this, beyond the narrow circle of his private interests. He might, had he so chosen, have evolved a system of governmental railway regulation, and have administered the system personally, or by his own agents, but he could never be brought to see the advantage to himself of rational concession to obtain a resultant of forces. He resisted all restraint, especially national restraint, believing that his one weapon, money, would be more effective in obtaining what he wanted in state legislatures than in Congress. Thus of necessity he precipitates a conflict instead of establishing an adjustment. He is therefore in essence a revolutionist without being aware of it. The same specialized thinking appears in his reasoning touching actual government. New York City will serve as an illustration. New York has for 2 generations been noted for a civic corruption which has been theoretically abominable to all good citizens, and which the capitalistic class has denounced as abominable to itself. I suspect this to be an imaginative conception of the situation. Tammany Hall is, I take it, the administrative bureau through which capital purchases its privileges. An incorruptible government would offend capital because, under such a government, capital would have to obey the law, and a privilege would cease. Occasionally, Tammany grows rapacious and exacts too much for its services. Then a reform movement is undertaken, and finally a new management is imposed on Tammany. But when Tammany has consented to a satisfactory sale of prices, the reform ends. To change the system would imply a shift in the seat of power. In fine, money is the weapon of the capitalist as the sword was the weapon of the medieval soldier. Only as the capitalist is more highly specialized than the soldier ever was, he is more helpless when his single weapon fails him. From the days of William the Conqueror to our own, the great soldier has been, very commonly, a famous statesman also, but I do not now remember, in English or American history, a single capitalist who has earned eminence for comprehensive statesmanship. On the contrary, although many have participated in public affairs, have held high office, and have shown ability therein, capitalists have not unusually, however unjustly, been suspected of having ulterior objects in view, unconnected with the public welfare, such as tariffs or land grants. Certainly, so far as I am aware, no capitalist has ever acquired such influence over his contemporaries as has been attained with apparent ease by men like Cromwell, Washington, or even Jackson. And this leads advancing in an orderly manner, step by step, to what is perhaps to me the most curious and interesting of all modern intellectual phenomena, connected with the specialized mind, the attitude of the capitalist toward the law. Naturally, the capitalist of all men might be supposed to be he who would respect and uphold the law most, considering that he is at once the wealthiest and most vulnerable of human beings, when called upon to defend himself by physical force. How defenseless and how incompetent he is in such exigencies, he proved to the world some years ago, when he plunged himself and the country into the great Pennsylvania coal strike, with absolutely no preparation. Nevertheless, in spite of his vulnerability, he is of all citizens the most lawless. He appears to assume that the law will always be enforced, and when he has need of it, by some special personnel whose duty lies that way, while he may evade the law when convenient or bring it into contempt with impunity. The capitalist seems incapable of feeling his responsibility, as a member of the governing class, in this respect, and that he is bound to uphold the law, no matter what the law may be, in order that others may do the like. If the capitalist has bought some sovereign function and wishes to abuse it for his own behoof, he regards the law which restrains him as a despotic invasion of his constitutional rights, because, with his specialized mind, he cannot grasp the relation of a sovereign function to the nation as a whole. He therefore looks upon the evasion of a law devised for public protection, but inimical to him, as innocent or even meritorious. If an election to be lost, and the legislature, which has been chosen by the majority, cannot be pacified by money, but passes some act which promises to be annoying, the first instinct of the capitalist is to retain counsel, not to advise him touching his duty under the law, but to advise a method by which he may elude it, or if he cannot elude it, by which he may have it annulled as unconstitutional by the courts. The lawyer who succeeds in this branch of practice is certain to win the highest prizes at the bar. And as capital has had now, for more than 1 or even 2 generations, all the prizes of the law within its gift, this attitude of capital has had a profound effect upon shaping the American legal mind. The capitalist, as I infer, regards the constitutional form of government which exists in the United States as a convenient method of obtaining his own way against a majority, but the lawyer has learned to worship it as a fetish. Nor is this astonishing, for, were written constitutions suppressed, he would lose most of his importance and much of his income. Quite honestly, therefore, the American lawyer has come to believe that a sheet of paper soiled with printer's ink, and interpreted by half a dozen elderly gentlemen snugly dozing in armchairs, has some inherent and marvellous virtue, by which it can arrest the march of omnipotent nature. And capital gladly accepts this view of American civilization, since hitherto capitalists have usually been able to select the magistrates who decide their causes, perhaps directly through the intervention of some president or governor whom they have had nominated by a convention controlled by their money, or else, if the judiciary has been elective, they have caused sympathetic judges to be chosen by means of a mechanism like Tammany, which they have frankly bought. I wish to make myself clearly understood. Neither capitalists nor lawyers are necessarily, or even probably, other than conscientious men. What they do is to think with specialized minds. All dominant types have been more or less specialized, if not so much as this, and this specialization has caused, as I understand it, that obtuseness of perception which has been their ruin when the environment who favored them has changed. All that is remarkable about the modern capitalist is the excess of his eccentricity, or his deviation from that resultant of forces to which he must conform. To us, however, at present, neither the morality nor the present mental eccentricity of the capitalist is so material as the possibility of his acquiring flexibility under pressure, for it would seem to be almost mathematically demonstrable that he will, in the near future, be subjected to a pressure under which he must develop flexibility, or be eliminated. There can be no doubt that the modern environment is changing faster than any environment ever previously changed. Therefore the social center of gravity constantly tends to shift more rapidly, and therefore modern civilization has unprecedented need of the administrative or generalizing mind. But as the mass and momentum of modern society is prodigious, it will require a correspondingly prodigious energy to carry it safely from an unstable to a stable equilibrium. The essential is to generate the energy which brings success, and the more the mind dwells upon the peculiarities of the modern capitalistic class, the more doubts obtrude themselves touching their ability to make the effort even at present, and still more so to make it in the future as the magnitude of the social organism grows. One source of capitalistic weakness comes from a lack of proper instruments wherewith to work, even supposing the will of capital to be good, and this lack of administrative ability is somewhat due to the capitalistic attitude toward education. In the United States, capital has long owned the leading universities by right of purchase, as it has owned the highways, the currency, and the press, and capital has used the universities in a general way to develop capitalistic ideas. This, however, is of no great moment. What is of moment is that capital has commercialized education. Apparently, modern society, if it is to cohere, must have a high order of generalizing mind, a mind which can grasp a multitude of complex relations. But this is a mind which can, at best, only be produced in small quantity and at high cost. Capital has preferred the specialized mind, and that not of the highest quality, since it has found it profitable to set quantity before quality to the limit which the market will endure. Capitalists have never insisted upon raising an educational standard, save in science and mechanics, and the relative overstimulation of the scientific mind has now become an actual menace to order, because of the inferiority of the administrative intelligence. Yet, even supposing the synthetic mind of the highest power to be increasing in proportion to the population instead of, as I suspect, pretty rapidly decreasing, and supposing the capitalist to be fully alive to the need of administrative improvements, a phalanx of Washingtons would be impotent to raise the administrative level of the United States materially, as long as the courts remain censors of legislation, because the province of the censorial court is to dislocate any comprehensive body of legislation, whose effect would be to change the social status. That was the fundamental purpose which underlay the adoption of a written constitution whose object was to keep local sovereignties intact, especially at the South. Jefferson insisted that each sovereignty should by means of nullification protect itself. It was a long step in advance when the nation conquered the prerogative of asserting its own sovereign power through the Supreme Court. Now the intervention of the courts in legislation has become, by the change in environment, as fatal to administration as would have been in 1800 the success of nullification. I find it difficult to believe that capital, with its specialized views of what constitutes its advantages, its duties and its responsibilities, and stimulated by a bar molded to meet its prejudices and requirements, will ever voluntarily assent to the consolidation of the United States to the point at which the interference of the courts with legislation might be eliminated, because, as I have pointed out, capital finds the judicial veto useful as a means of at least temporarily evading the law, while the bar, taken as a whole, quite honestly, believes that the universe will obey the judicial decree. No delusion could be profounder, and none perhaps more dangerous. Courts, I need hardly say, cannot control nature, though by trying to do so they may, like the Parliament of Paris, create a friction which shall induce an appalling catastrophe. True, judicial courts, whether in times of peace or of revolution, seldom fail to be a substantial protection to the weak, because they enforce an established corpus juris, and conduct trials by recognized forms. It is startling to compare the percentage of convictions to prosecutions for the same class of offenses in the regular criminal courts during the French Revolution, with the percentage in the Revolutionary Tribunal. And once a stable social equilibrium is reached, all men tend to support judicial courts, if judicial courts exist, from an instinct of self-preservation. This has been amply shown by French experience, and it is here that French history is so illuminating to the American mind. Before the Revolution, France had semi-political courts which conduced to the overthrow of Turgot and therefore wrought for violence. But more than this, France, under the old regime, had evolved a legal profession of a cast of mind incompatible with an equal administration of the law. The French courts were therefore, when trouble came, supported only by a faction, and were cast aside. With that the old regime fell. The young Duke of Chartres, the son of Égalité Orleans and the future Louis Philippe, has related in his journal an anecdote which illustrates that subtle poison of distrust which undermines all legal authority the moment that suspicion of political partiality in the judiciary enters the popular mind. In June 1791 the Duke went down from Paris to Vendôme to join the regiment of dragoons of which he had been commissioned colonel. One day, soon after he joined, a messenger came to him in haste to tell him that a mob had gathered near by who were about to hang two priests. "I ran thither at once," wrote the Duke. "I spoke to those who seemed most excited and impressed upon them how horrible it was to hang men without trial. Besides, to act as hangmen was to enter a trade which they all thought infamous, that they had judges, and that this was their affair. They answered that their judges were aristocrats, and that they did not punish the guilty." That is to say, although the priests were non-jurors, and therefore criminals in the eye of the law, the courts would not enforce the law because of the political bias. "It is your fault," I said to them, "since you elected them the judges, but that is no reason why you should do justice yourselves." Danton explained in the convention that it was because of the deep distrust of the judiciary in the public mind, which this anecdote shows, that the September massacres occurred, and it was because all Republicans knew that the state and the army were full of traitors like Dumouriez, whom the ordinary courts would not punish, that Danton brought forward his bill to organize a true political tribunal to deal with them summarily. When Danton carried through this statute he supposed himself to be at the apex of power and popularity, and to be safe if any man in France were safe. Very shortly he learned the error in his calculation. Billaud, who was a member of the Committee of Public Safety, while Danton had allowed himself to be dropped from membership. Danton had just been married, and to an aristocratic wife, and the turmoil of office had grown to be distasteful to him. On March 30, 1794, Billaud somewhat casually remarked, "We must kill Danton," for in truth Danton, with conservative leanings, was becoming a grave danger to the extreme Jacobians. Had he lived a few months longer, he would have been a Thermidorist. Billaud therefore only expressed the prevailing Jacobin opinion, so the Jacobins arrested Danton, Camille Desmoulins and his other friends, and Danton at once anticipated what would be his doom. As he entered his cell, he said to his jailer, "I erected the tribunal. I ask pardon of God and men." But even yet he did not grasp the full meaning of what he had done. At his trial he wished to introduce his evidence fully, protesting that he should understand the tribunal since he created it. Nevertheless, he did not understand the tribunal. He still regarded it as more or less a court. Topino Lebrun, the artist, did understand it. Topino sat on the jury which tried Danton and observed that the heart of one of his colleagues seemed failing him. Topino took the waverer aside and said, "This is not a trial, it is a measure. Two men are impossible, one must perish. Will you kill Robespierre? No, then by that admission you condemn Danton." Lebrun in these few words went to the root of the matter, and stated the identical principle which underlies our whole doctrine of the police power. A political court is not properly a court at all, but an administrative board whose function is to work the will of the dominant faction for the time being. Thus a political court becomes the most formidable of all engines for the destruction of its creators, the instant the social equilibrium shifts. So Danton found in the spring of 1794, when the equilibrium shifted, and so Robespierre, who slew Danton, found the next July when the equilibrium shifted again. Danton died on the 5th April, 1794. About 3 months later, Jourdan won the Fleurist campaign. Straightway Thermidor followed, and the tribunal worked as well for the party of Thermidor as it had for the Jacobins. Carrier, who had wallowed in blood at Nantes as the ideal Jacobin, walked behind the cart which carried Robespierre to the scaffold, shouting, "Down with the tyrant!" but that did not save him. In vain he protested to the Convention that were he guilty the whole Convention was guilty, down to the President's bell. By a vote of 498 out of 500, Carrier was sent before the tribunal, which, even though reorganized, condemned him. Theresia Cabarrus gaily presided at the closing of the Jacobin Club. Tallien moved over to the benches on the right, and therefore the court was ruthless to Fouquet. On the 11th Thermidor, 70 members, officers or partisans of the Commune of Paris, were sent to the guillotine in only 2 batches. On the next day 12 more followed, 4 of whom were jurymen. Fouquet's turn came later. It may also be worth while for Americans to observe that a political court is quite as effective against property as against life. The Duke of Orleans is only the most celebrated example of a host of Frenchmen who perished, not because of revenge, fear, or jealousy, but because the party in power wanted their property. The famous law touching suspected persons, Loi des Suspects, was passed on September 17, 1793. On October 10, 1793, that is 3 weeks afterward, Saint Just moved that additional powers should be granted by the Convention to the Committee of Public Safety, defining by way of justification for his motion those who fell within the purview of this law. Among these first of all came the rich, who by that fact alone were to be considered prima facie enemies to their country. As I stated at the beginning of this chapter, history never can repeat itself, therefore, whatever else may happen in the United States, we certainly shall have no revolutionary tribunal like the French tribunal of 1793. But the mechanical principle of the political court always remains the same. It is an administrative board, the control of which is useful, or may be even essential, to the success of a dominant faction, and the instinctive comprehension which the American people have of this truth is demonstrated by the determination with which they have for many years sought to impose the will of the majority upon the judiciary. Other means failing to meet their expectations, they have now hit on the recall, which as revolutionary in essence as were the methods used during the Terror. Courts from the Supreme Court downward, if purged by recall, or a process tantamount to recall, would, under proper stress, work as surely for a required purpose as did the tribunal supervised by Fouquet Tinville. These considerations rather lead me to infer that the extreme complexity of the administrative problems presented by modern industrial civilization is beyond the compass of the capitalistic mind. If this be so, American society, as at present organized, with capitalists for the dominant class, can concentrate no further, and, as nothing in the universe is at rest, if it does not concentrate, it must, probably, begin to disintegrate. Indeed, we may perceive incipient signs of disintegration all about us. We see, for example, an universal contempt for law, incarnated in the capitalistic class itself, which is responsible for order, and in spite of the awful danger which impends over every rich and physically helpless type, should the coercive power collapse. We see it even more distinctly in the chronic war between capital and labor, which government is admittedly unable to control. We see it in the slough of urban politics, inseparable from capitalistic methods of maintaining its ascendancy, and, perhaps most disquieting of all, we see it in the dissolution of the family, which has for untold ages been the seat of discipline and the foundation of authority. For the dissolution of the family is peculiarly a phenomenon of our industrial age, and it is caused by the demand of industry for the cheap labor of women and children. Napoleon told the lawyers who drafted the code that he insisted on one thing alone. They must fortify the family, for, said he, if the family is responsible to the father and the father to me, I can keep order in France. One of the difficulties, therefore, which capital has to meet, by the aid of such administrative ability as it can command, is how to keep order when society no longer rests on the cohesive family, but on highly volatilized individuals as incohesive as grains of sand. Meditating upon these matters, it is hard to resist the persuasion that unless capital can, in the immediate future, generate an intellectual energy beyond the sphere of its specialized calling, very much in excess of any intellectual energy of which it has hitherto given promise, and unless it can, besides, rise to an appreciation of diverse social conditions, as well as to a level of political sagacity, far higher than it has attained within recent years, its relative power in the community must decline. If this be so, the symptoms which indicate social disintegration will intensify. As they intensify, the ability of industrial capital to withstand the attacks made upon it will lessen, and this process must go on until capital abandons the contest to defend itself as too costly. Then nothing remains but flight. Under what conditions industrial capital would find migration from America possible must remain for us beyond the bounds even of speculation. It might escape with little or no loss. On the other hand, it might fare as hardly as the Southern slaveholders. No man can foresee his fate. In the event of adverse fortune, however, the position of capitalists would hardly be improved by the existence of political courts, serving a malevolent majority. Whatever may be in store for us, here at least we reach an intelligible conclusion. Should nature follow such a course as I have suggested, she will settle all our present perplexities as simply and as drastically as she is apt to settle human perturbations, and she will follow logically in the infinitely extended line of her own most impressive precedents. End of chapter 6. Inferences. End of the theory of social revolutions.